The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air itself is holding its breath. All eyes were on the judge, a stern man with a reputation for his no-nonsense demeanor. He leaned back in his chair, his lips curling into a smirk as he looked down at the woman standing before him. She was tall, with a confident posture, but it was clear from the way the judge's eyes flicked over her that he had already made up his mind about her. She was overweight, black, and dressed in a simple, unassuming outfit. Nothing about her screamed power or influence. And that, it seemed, was his mistake. The woman, whose name was Angela, had been called to the stand for what seemed like a routine case, a minor traffic violation, something so trivial it barely warranted a second thought. But as the judge began to speak, his tone dripping with condescension, it became clear that this wasn't going to be a typical hearing. He made a snide remark about her appearance, a comment that drew a few nervous chuckles from the gallery. Angela didn't flinch. She stood there, her expression calm, almost amused, as if she knew something no one else in the room did. The judge, emboldened by the reaction of the crowd, continued to mock her, his words growing sharper, more cutting. He questioned her credibility, her intelligence, even her worth. It was a display of arrogance that made the air in the room grow even heavier, the tension palpable. But Angela didn't respond. Not yet. She simply waited, her eyes locked on his, until he finally paused, expecting her to shrink under the weight of his words. That's when she smiled. It wasn't a nervous smile, or one of submission. It was the kind of smile that sent a shiver down your spine, the kind that made you realize you'd underestimated someone in a way you couldn't take back. And then she spoke. Her voice was calm, steady, but there was a power behind it that made the room go still. "Your Honor," she began, "before we proceed, there's something you should know." The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "And what might that be?" he asked, his tone mocking. Angela reached into her bag and pulled out a small, unassuming badge. She held it up, letting the light catch the metallic surface. The room seemed to hold its breath as the judge's eyes narrowed, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. And then, as the realization dawned on him, his smirk faltered. The badge was unmistakable. A CIA insignia. The gallery erupted in whispers, the sound like a wave crashing through the room. The judge's face went pale, his earlier confidence evaporating in an instant. He stammered, trying to regain his composure, but it was too late. Angela had already turned to face the room, her presence commanding attention. "I'm not just here for a traffic violation," she said, her voice cutting through the noise. "I'm here on official business, and trust me, Your Honor, you're going to want to hear what I have to say." The room fell silent again, the weight of her words hanging in the air. The judge, now visibly shaken, leaned forward, his earlier arrogance replaced by something else. Fear? Curiosity? It was hard to tell. But one thing was clear. This was no ordinary case. And as Angela began to speak, her words painting a picture of a story far bigger than anyone in that courtroom could have imagined, the tension in the room reached a breaking point. What was her mission? Why was she here? And what did it have to do with the judge? The answers to those questions would come, but not yet. For now, all anyone could do was wait, their hearts pounding, as Angela's story began to unfold. And as the camera pans out, leaving the courtroom behind, one thing is certain. This is just the beginning. The judge's gavel slipped from his hand, clattering onto the bench as he stared at Angela, his mouth slightly open. The room, already tense, seemed to freeze in time. Even the bailiff, who had been leaning casually against the wall, straightened up, his hand instinctively moving closer to his sidearm. Angela's badge gleamed under the fluorescent lights, a silent reminder of the authority she carried. But it wasn't just the badge that commanded attention. It was the way she held herself, the quiet confidence that seemed to radiate from her. This wasn't a woman who needed to shout to be heard. Her presence alone was enough to make the entire courtroom sit up and take notice. The judge cleared his throat, his voice shaky as he finally found his words. "Ms. Carter," he began, using the name she had given when she entered the courtroom. I wasn't aware that you were—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Angela didn't wait for him to recover. She stepped closer to the bench, her eyes never leaving his. "Your Honor," she said, her tone firm but not unkind. "There's a lot you're not aware of. And that's why I'm here." The gallery buzzed with whispers again, but Angela didn't seem to notice. She reached into her bag once more, this time pulling out a sealed manila envelope. She held it up for the judge to see, her expression unreadable. "This," she said, "contains information that directly concerns you. And before we proceed, I need to know if you're willing to cooperate." The judge's face went from pale to ashen. He glanced at the envelope, then back at Angela, his mind clearly racing. "Cooperate?" he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "With what, exactly?" Angela didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned to the bailiff and nodded, toward the door. "Clear the room," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. The bailiff hesitated, looking to the judge for confirmation. But the judge, still reeling, simply nodded. Within minutes, the gallery was empty, the heavy wooden doors closing with a finality that echoed through the now silent courtroom. When it was just the two of them, Angela walked over to the bench and placed the envelope in front of the judge. "Open it," she said, her voice calm but firm. The judge's hands trembled as he reached for the envelope, his fingers fumbling with the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper, along with a photograph. He picked up the photo first, his breath catching in his throat as he stared at it. The image was grainy, but there was no mistaking the face staring back at him. It was his own. The judge's eyes darted to the sheet of paper, scanning the words quickly. As he read, his expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, and finally, to something that looked a lot like fear. He looked up at Angela, his voice barely a whisper. This can't be real," he said, his hands shaking so badly that the paper slipped from his grasp and fluttered to the floor. Angela bent down to pick it up, her movements deliberate and unhurried. She placed the paper back on the bench, her eyes never leaving his. "It's real," she said simply. "And it's just the beginning." The judge sank back into his chair, his mind racing. The document in front of him was a classified report, detailing a series of covert operations that had taken place over the past year. Operations that he had unknowingly been a part of. According to the report, his courtroom had been used as a front for something far more sinister. A network of illegal activities that spanned across state lines, involving some of the most powerful people in the country. And at the center of it all was a name he recognized all too well. His own. How is this possible?" he stammered, his voice barely audible. "I had no idea. I swear, I didn't know." Angela held up a hand, cutting him off. "I believe you," she said, her tone softening slightly. "But that doesn't change the fact that you're involved. And if we're going to stop this, I need your help." The judge stared at her, his mind reeling. He had always prided himself on being a man of integrity, someone who upheld the law and served justice. But now, faced with the reality of what had been happening right under his nose, he felt like a stranger to himself. "What do you need me to do?" he asked, his voice trembling. Angela leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "First, you need to tell me everything you know. Every case, every person who's come through this courtroom in the past year. No detail is too small." She paused, her eyes locking onto his. "And second, you need to trust me. Because if we're going to take these people down, we're going to have to move carefully. One wrong step, and this whole thing could blow up in our faces." The judge nodded, his mind still spinning. He had no idea what he was getting himself into, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't walk away. Not now. Not after what he'd seen. "All right," he said, his voice steadier now. "I'll do whatever it takes." Angela gave him a small nod, her expression unreadable. "Good," she said, "because this is bigger than both of us, and if we're going to make it out of this alive, we're going to have to work together." As she spoke, the weight of her words settled over the room like a thick fog. The judge felt a chill run down his spine, a sense of foreboding that he couldn't shake. He had no idea what was coming next, but he knew one thing for certain. His life was about to change in ways he couldn't even begin to imagine. And as Angela turned to leave, the envelope still sitting on the bench between them, the judge couldn't help but wonder if he'd made the right choice. Because once you step into the shadows, it's hard to find your way back into the light. And the shadows, he realized, were where Angela Carter thrived. The judge, whose name was Harold Bennett, sat alone in his chambers long after Angela left. The envelope lay on his desk, its contents spread out like a puzzle he couldn't quite piece together. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of it all. How had his courtroom, a place he had always considered a sanctuary of justice, become a hub for something so dark? He thought back to the cases he'd presided over in the past year. Routine traffic violations, petty thefts, the occasional domestic dispute. Nothing had seemed out of the ordinary. But now, as he replayed each case in his mind, he began to notice patterns. Certain names kept popping up. Certain lawyers. Certain defendants. It was as if a thread had been woven through his courtroom, connecting cases that, on the surface, had nothing to do with each other. Harold's hands trembled as he reached for his phone. He needed to talk to someone, anyone, who could help him make sense of this. But who could he trust? The report Angela had shown him implicated not just low-level criminals, but high-ranking officials, law enforcement, even other judges. This thought sent a cold wave of fear through him. If these people were willing to go to such lengths to cover their tracks, what would they do to someone who threatened to expose them? Meanwhile, Angela was already on the move. She left the courthouse, through a side exit, her eyes scanning the street as she walked. She knew better than to let her guard down, even for a second. The people she was up against were dangerous, and they had eyes everywhere. She pulled out her phone and dialed a number from memory. It rang twice before a voice answered, low and steady. "Status?" the voice asked. "He's in," Angela replied, keeping her voice calm. "But he's scared. We'll need to keep a close eye on him." "Understood," the voice said. "And the others?" Angela hesitated, her grip tightening on the phone. "They're still in play. We'll need to move carefully. One wrong step, and this whole thing could blow up." The voice on the other end of the line was silent for a moment. "You know what's at stake," it said finally. "Don't let them get to him." Angela nodded, even though she knew the person on the other end couldn't see her. "I won't," she said. "But we're running out of time." As she ended the call, Angela slipped her phone back into her pocket and continued down the street. Her mind was already racing ahead, planning her next move. She had been working on this case for months, following leads that had taken her from one end of the country to the other. And now, finally, she was close. But close wasn't enough. She needed to be sure. One misstep, one overlooked detail, and everything could come crashing down. Back in his chambers, Harold was still staring at the documents in front of him. His eyes kept drifting back to one name in particular, a name that sent a chill down his spine. Marcus Delaney. He hadn't thought about Marcus in years. They had gone to law school together, back in the day. Marcus had always been ambitious, always looking for ways to get ahead. But this was something else entirely. Harold's stomach churned as he realized the extent of Marcus's involvement. If the report was to be believed, Marcus wasn't just a part of this network. He was one of its key players. Harold's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. He jumped, his heart pounding as he quickly gathered the documents and shoved them back into the envelope. "Come in," he called, his voice strained. The door opened, and a young clerk stepped inside, holding a stack of files. "Sorry to bother you, Judge Bennett," she said, "but these need your signature before the end of the day." Harold forced a smile, trying to hide the panic in his eyes. "Of course," he said, taking the files from her. "I'll get to them right away." As the clerk left, Harold let out a shaky breath. He couldn't afford to let anyone see how rattled he was. He needed to keep up appearances, at least for now. But as he glanced down at the files in his hands, he couldn't help but wonder if any of them were connected to the network Angela had uncovered. The thought made his stomach twist. How deep did this go? And how many people were involved? Later that evening, Harold found himself sitting in a dimly lit diner on the outskirts of town. He had chosen the place carefully. It was quiet, out of the way, and most importantly, not somewhere he was likely to run into anyone he knew. Across from him sat Angela, her expression calm but focused. They had agreed to meet here to discuss their next steps, but Harold couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. "We need to move quickly," Angela said, her voice low. "The longer we wait, the more time they have to cover their tracks." Harold nodded, though his mind was still reeling. "What do you need from me?" he asked. Angela leaned in closer, her eyes locking onto his. "I need you to keep doing what you've been doing. Preside over cases, sign off on paperwork, act like nothing's wrong. But I also need you to keep your eyes open. If you notice anything at all, that seems off, you let me know immediately." Harold swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling over him. "And what about Marcus?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do we do about him?" Angela's expression darkened at the mention of Marcus's name. "We'll deal with him," she said, "but not yet. Right now, we need to focus on gathering evidence. If we move too soon, he'll slip through our fingers." Harold nodded again, though he couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in his chest. He had always thought of himself as a man of principle, someone who stood for justice. But now, faced with the reality of what he was up against, he couldn't help but wonder if he had what it took to see this through. As they left the diner, Harold couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He glanced over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the dark street, but there was no one there. Still, the feeling lingered, a constant reminder of the danger they were in. And as he drove home, his mind racing with thoughts of what was to come, one question kept echoing in his mind. How far was he willing to go to bring these people to justice? The answer, he realized, was something he wasn't ready to face. Not yet.